So now we want to move our discussion to chapter 5 of the textbook, which is related to international economics. When we are talking about international economics, we are talking about an open economy. So to begin with, we want to compare open economy versus closed economy. Before today's lecture, most of the time we have been talking about the closed economy. When we look at the closed economy, we always assume whatever amount that is produced will be either consumed or invested. If we have government into our system, then it will be whatever amount need to be either consumed or invested or spent by the government. Therefore, we claim that under the closed economy, it will be y equals c plus I plus g. The y is the output, the c is the consumption, the investment is the I, and the g is the government expenditure. So then it turned out that the total output will need to be equal the total amount that is spent. So then here we know that the total amount of good that is produced will be the total spending of the economy. Therefore, we can rearrange the equation and then we say output minus the consumption minus the government expenditure need to be equal the saving of the nation. So then if we look at this equation, we will then turn out to find out that given that the y equals c plus I plus g, so then when we have y minus c minus g, it equals the investment. So in here we show that under the closed economy, the total amount of the saving need to be equal the total amount of the investment of the nation. That's the reason why we do this when we are doing our earlier analysis, because we want to simplify our analysis. We want to have the goods market to be in equilibrium such that the total amount saved need to be equal the total amount of investment. But we know that we are in fact facing an open economy. When we are talking about the national income identity, we define the total output equal the consumption plus investment plus the government expenditure plus the exports minus the import. Therefore, under this scenario, the total saving of the nation remains as the total amount of goods that is produced minus the private sector consumption and the government spending. But then it no longer equal to the investment of the nation. That is because from the national income account identity, we know y minus c minus g in fact not only equals investment but also plus the net exports. So in here we know that under an open economy, the output no longer equal to spending because the total spending of the nation is still as the private consumption add up the government expenditure. But then the sum of the goods that is produced will be exported and then consumed by someone outside of the country. So then under this case, the output no longer equal the spending of the nation. So then we know that when we allow the analysis that based on an open economy, then the analysis will be more complicated because now the domestic goods market no longer in equilibrium because the total amount saved does not equal to the total amount invested. But we have to admit that in fact we are participating in a global economy, there are trade. For example, in Taiwan, when we go to the fruit store, you will see some domestic produced fruits. For example, bananas and grapes. However, a lot of time you will also see some kiwis and some oranges that were imported from South Africa and some apples that were imported from Japan. Therefore, in our daily life, we do see a lot of import. However, you may say that I usually only buy the goods that is domestic produced. In that case, do I still involve some international economic activities? Well, even though you do not directly involve some international economic activities, someone may do it for you. Why that is so? For example, you can choose to save your money in the domestic banks, and then they may lend your money, for example, to TSMC, which is a Taiwanese company. Up to this part, all the activities are domestic. But then TSMC may need to invest in the US to expand their business. Therefore, even though we do not personally choose to involve in the international economic activities, a lot of time we indirectly contribute to the international economic activities. In the case of TSMC, the TSMC is a domestic company. The money that you put in the bank is also a domestic bank. But then the TSMC somehow borrow the money you save in the bank and then invest abroad. So then you still contributed to the investment that TSMC made, because some of your savings now become the US investment. So then we have to admit that we are living in a world that in fact is an open economy, and we more or less involved in the international economic activities. Therefore, the concept of the open economy is closer to the reality. The reason why before the discussion today we focus on the closed economy is because we want to simplify our analysis. So then now what I want to do next is I want to give you an idea about how important is trade. To do that, I need to tell you a measurement about the openness. Then you can have a better idea about to what extent a different economy involved in trade. So now I would like to define the measurements of openness, and I want you guys to think about how to measure that. Given that trade is an important feature of the openness of an economy, therefore we want to focus on the variable related to exports and imports. But first of all, if we use only the exports as a measurement for the openness, we need to admit that it is not quite good a measurement, because it is possible that the economy do not export at all, but the economy imports quite a lot. In that case, we cannot say that the economy is not at all involved in the international economic activities. So same thing happened to the import. It could be that the country imports nothing, but then you cannot say that country does not involve in any international economic activities, because the country can possibly export quite a lot. Therefore, simply looking at the exports or the imports cannot capture the concept of the openness. So then how about net exports, which is exports minus imports? Well, let's take a look at an example that if an economy does not involve in any international economic activities, therefore their exports equal 0 and import equals 0, then for sure it is a closed economy and the exports minus import would be 0. But it could be another country that has its export equal to its import, and it turned out to have the net export equal 0, but then the value of the export and import both equal 100 million. So then it is for sure an open economy. So again, this measurement is not a good measurement. You then say, okay, if that is the case, I just add them up. So then if we add it up, then this measurement shows the total amount of the trade that a nation involved. Then in fact, it is a better measurement. We have to admit that, but there is still some problem with these measurements. So now let's take a look at an example. So for example, a country A, it imports 300 apples and exports 400 apples. For country B, it also imports 300 apples and exports 400 apples. Then if we look at these numbers, you will say, hey, if that is the case, it's possible that these two countries somehow have the same amount of the exports and imports. So then they may have involved a similar degree of the international economic activities. But then, is that true? So there is one more condition I didn't tell you, is that the country A produces 500 apples, But for country B, in fact, the total output of apples is 100 million. So then for country B, most of its goods that is produced is exported, and they also import quite a lot of the apples compared with the size of apple they produce. But for country B, the number of exports apples is relatively small compared with the size of the total output. And same thing for the import. Therefore, we claim that even though country A and B have similar amounts of the imports and exports, but for sure country A are much open than country B. So in here we know that if we want to have a better measurement of the openness of the economy, we need to also adjust for how much they produce domestically. Otherwise, we may overestimate the openness of a country that have larger size of production. Therefore, we claim that a better measurement for openness is the add up of the export and the import divided by the total output. So the openness degree of an economy based on this measurement can be more than 200%, and it can be also be less than 30%. So now let's take a look at some examples. For example, Luxembourg. Its average openness from 1970 to 2020 is more than 200%. The minimum, which happened in 1972, is about 151, which is 1.5 times of the size of its output. The amount that is maximum happened in 2015, which is more than 4 times of its domestic output. So we have to admit that Luxembourg involved quite a lot of the international economic activities. How about for the US? The average openness of US is only 21%. The mean happened in 1970, which is only about 11%. The max, which happened in 2011, is only about 31%. So then we argue that the US is a relatively less open economy compared with Luxembourg. And that is why when we are doing a lot of the macro analysis, we can have our model that starts from a closed economy for simplification, because of a lot of economic models are built based on the US data at the very beginning. So then to make life much easier for the analysis, it's quite straightforward that we just assume it is a closed economy, and then we move on to do the analysis and see what happened to the economy. So then how about for Taiwan? It turned out that the average is about 110. The mean happened in 1993, which is only about 85%. The max happened in 2011, which is about 155% of its output. So Taiwan is also an economy that is relatively open compared with the US. Its total amount of trade is about the same size as the total amount of the output. So then, what will be the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the openness? Let's take a look at example for Taiwan. It turned out that the openness measurement tell us the degree of trade in 2019 is 116, but then in 2020 it fell to only about 102. So it's quite clear, because the pandemic started to happen by the end of the 2019, but that spread out to the world in 2020. Therefore, the pandemic does affect the openness of Taiwan from the perspective of the openness measurement. But if we look at the quarterly data, you will see that from quarter 4 2020 onward, this number gradually increased. And by the third quarter of 2021, the openness now increased to 123%, which is exceeding the average in the past. So it means that the economy started to open up in terms of its trade again, starting from the end of the 2020. So in here we complete our discussion related to the comparison of closed economy versus an open economy. So the topic that we are going to move on to talk about is about the goods market equilibrium in an open economy.